I had always thought the stories about the thing in the Coldwater Creek woods were just old trapper tales meant to keep tourists from wandering too deep into the pines. But 3 weeks ago, something happened that made me realize the warnings weren't just superstition, they were survival instructions. And now I can't stop thinking about how close I came to becoming another name whispered around campfires. It started when I drove up from Mason Ridge to spend the weekend at my uncle's hunting cabin, a crooked little shack at the edge of the game reserve where the tree line thickens into a black wall of conifers, and the mist never seems to burn off even at noon. Uncle Ray had been gone for a few years now, disappeared on a late-season elk hunt and declared lost to the elements, but the cabin was still stocked with tins and kerosene, so I figured I'd stay there while scouting for deer. The first night was quiet except for the occasional crack of ice shifting on the creek and the creak of the cabin timbers settling. But just before dawn, I woke up to what sounded like a low moan rolling through the trees. Not like any animal I'd heard before, more like a horn echoing underwater, and it made my teeth buzz. When I stepped onto the porch, the mist was thick as milk and smelled of wet fur. Something large had moved across the clearing in the night, leaving deep, round impressions in the frost, like footprints, but far too wide and too long for a man, with a dragging mark between them, as if a tail or heavy branch had been pulled along. I followed the tracks a few yards until they vanished at the creek's edge where the water churned with an odd greenish foam. I should have gone back inside, locked the door, and waited for daylight, but instead I stood there straining to hear over the rush of water until a stone clattered somewhere up the bank, and something huge exhaled a foggy breath I could see even from 20 feet away. The smell hit me then, sweet and rotten at once, like meat left in a hot car, and my legs moved before my brain did. I stumbled back to the cabin and slammed the door, heart hammering as the boards vibrated under a soft thud outside, almost curious, like a hand pressing gently but insistently against the wall. For the rest of that day, I sat by the window clutching Uncle Ray's old .30-06 and watched the trees sway. But nothing came into view except a single crow that landed on the railing and stared at me with a milky eye until dusk. That night the moan rose again, closer now, joined by a second deeper note like two voices harmonizing in a way that made my stomach twist. I tried to sleep, but every time my eyes closed, I saw a shape crouch just beyond the tree line, massive shoulders hunched, arms dragging long enough to touch the ground, its outline shivering like heat waves. When dawn finally broke, I found more prints circling the cabin, overlapping like a dance, and tufts of coarse black hair snagged on the porch posts that smelled of damp soil and iron. That was the moment I remembered Uncle Ray's journal, hidden under a loose floorboard, the one my mother said the police had never recovered. I pried up the plank, and there it was, swollen from moisture, pages scrawled with sketches of a hulking man-thing with blind white eyes and a split jaw, and in the margins he'd written, "It is not alone," over and over until the ink bled through. The last entry simply read, "If you hear it singing, don't look out the window." Now, sitting here as the mist creeps back over the clearing and the first low note rolls through the pines, I understand what he meant, but I think it's already too late because whatever's out there has learned that I'm alone and the singing has stopped, replaced by silence so complete my ears ring, and in that ringing I can hear my own pulse and something else moving closer, heavy and deliberate, like the woods themselves are walking toward me. I don't remember grabbing the rifle, but when the silence fell, I found myself clutching it so tight my knuckles ached, the wood slick with sweat, and the only sound left was my heart hammering against my ribs as I crouched by the window, staring into the gray wall of mist where the clearing should have been but was now gone, as if the cabin were floating in some endless, shifting sea of trees. For a moment I thought maybe it had retreated. Maybe the prints and hair and low moaning were some waking nightmare. But then the boards under my feet creaked with a weight that wasn't mine, and a long nail scraped gently along the outside wall like someone testing the grain. I pressed my back against the stove and tried not to breathe as the sound moved around the cabin, slow, deliberate, each step followed by a faint clicking like teeth snapping shut. Then came a wet sniffing at the door, and the unmistakable impression of something enormous lowering its head to the seam, inhaling. I don't know why, but the smell of iron filled my nose and my eyes watered. I imagined it crouching there, broad shoulders rising and falling, nostrils flaring like bellows as it tasted the air between us. My uncle's journal lay open on the table to a page I hadn't seen before, where he'd sketched a crude map of the creek and marked a hollow symbol deep in the pines labeled burrow, and under it he'd written, "Tracks vanish here, something under the roots." I wanted to scream, but instead I whispered his words to myself like a charm. The sniffing stopped. The boards groaned once more, and then there was nothing but that ringing silence, heavier than any noise. Minutes passed, or maybe an hour, before I heard a splash from the creek and a low thrumming under the floorboards, as if a freight train were passing deep underground. Then the cabin door latch rattled twice, slow and careful. I raised the rifle, sighted on the door, but my hands trembled so badly the barrel bobbed, and I knew if it burst in, I wouldn't hit anything vital. Instead of breaking through, the thing began to circle again, closer this time. Its footfalls like sacks of wet sand dropped on the earth, and the singing returned. Not the low moan, but a high, tremulous note like a child's voice echoing down a pipe, rising and falling in patterns that made my teeth ache. My vision blurred. I realized it wasn't singing at me. It was singing at something else, somewhere beyond the cabin. In the trees, something answered, a deeper note that rolled like distant thunder. The two sounds twined together until my chest vibrated, and the lantern flickered, casting the room in frantic shadows. That's when I saw movement at the edge of the window, a second shape sliding between the pines, taller but thinner, moving with a spider-like grace. My uncle had been right. It was not alone. The singing stopped again, and for a heartbeat, the world felt hollow, empty, of wind and water and time. And then a pale hand, or what I thought was a hand, pressed flat against the glass, fingers too long, joints wrong, black claws curling at the tips. I stumbled back, tripping over the journal, and landed hard on the floor as the window frame cracked like ice. The lantern went out. In the dark, the smell of wet fur and soil swelled until it filled my lungs, and I could hear them breathing. Two of them. One at the door and one at the broken window. Their breaths out of sync but almost conversational, like they were deciding something. I crawled toward the trap door under the bed, the one my uncle had used for storing tools, thinking maybe I could hide there until daylight. But when I yanked it open, a gust of cold, earthy air rose up, carrying the same greenish foam stink as the creek. And I saw that the space below wasn't just a crawl space, but a tunnel slanting down into darkness where something massive had been moving recently, walls slick with claw marks and hair. A choice bloomed in my mind: stay in the cabin and face what was coming through the door, or drop into the tunnel and risk whatever had carved it. I heard the latch splinter. Without thinking, I swung my legs into the hole, clutching the rifle across my chest, and slid down into the cold, wet dark as the cabin above me filled with a sound halfway between a scream and a laugh. The tunnel swallowed me whole, a slick throat of mud and roots slanting so steeply that I slid on my back like a dropped corpse down a chute, my boots scraping for purchase as cold slime soaked through my jeans, and the rifle knocked against my collarbone with every jolt, And above me, the rectangle of cabin light shrank and tilted until it snapped out completely with a heavy thud, like a trapdoor slamming shut. The air down there was heavy, metallic, and wet, and smelled like the creek had been rotting underground for a century. Every breath felt like inhaling coppery mist. The walls were ribbed with roots as thick as my arm, and gouged deep with parallel claw marks that glistened faintly, as if something oily seeped from them. I tried to slow myself, but the mud was slicker than grease, and soon I tumbled into a level chamber about the size of a living room, landing hard on my shoulder with a grunt that echoed far too long. The floor was packed with hair, bones, and flattened moss like some crude nest. Broken antlers jutted from the muck at odd angles, and at the center lay a pile of stones arranged into a crude spiral filled with green foam that pulsed faintly like it was breathing. My heart slammed against my ribs as I backed against the wall, trying not to crunch any bones underfoot. Somewhere deeper in the tunnel, a wet dragging sound moved closer, and above me, through the mud ceiling, I could hear muffled thuds as if heavy bodies were circling directly overhead. The rifle felt like a toy in my hands. I could barely thumb the safety off because my fingers were slick with mud and shaking. In the corner of the chamber sat something that looked like my uncle's canteen, and next to it a torn scrap of flannel that could only have come from his old hunting jacket. I wanted to call his name, but the sound of my own voice seemed dangerous here, like a flare in enemy territory. Instead, I crouched low and crept toward a smaller tunnel, at the far side where cold air hissed out in gusts. Just as I reached it, a low humming began to vibrate the roots, rising from below rather than above, and the green foam inside the stone spiral started to froth as if boiling. A hand, or paw, slid out of the tunnel mouth ahead of me, not reaching but feeling, its claws clicking lightly on the stones like a blind person tapping for a curb. I froze, every muscle locked, and the humming deepened until my teeth ached. Then, from somewhere behind me in the chamber, a second hand emerged from the mud wall itself, pushing through as if the earth were a curtain, followed by a slick arm of black hair and gray skin. It wasn't a tunnel at all, it was a nest, and the walls themselves were porous with openings. One of the creatures hissed a sound like wet paper tearing, and the claws in front of me curled into a beckoning gesture that made my stomach lurch. My uncle's journal had said nothing about this. His last entry stopped at the word burrow. I raised the rifle, fired blind into the dark ahead, the muzzle flash searing an instant of vision into my mind. A long face split by a jaw too wide, eyes like cloudy marbles, a body hunched low but long enough to fill the passage, and behind it more shapes, moving, retreating but not afraid, just making room. The shot's echo ricocheted down the tunnels, and for a heartbeat, everything went still, except the ringing in my ears. Then the humming stopped, and something far below bellowed a note so deep the stones jumped and dirt rained from the ceiling. The claws withdrew. All at once the walls began to shift, roots tightening like a noose, mud sloughing off to reveal rough-hewn stone steps spiraling down as if the earth itself were rearranging to guide me deeper. I backed toward the center of the chamber, but the green foam flared bright enough to paint my hands phosphorescent, and from the new stairwell rose a wind that smelled of cold caves and old blood. Above, the muffled thuds became frantic, multiple bodies scrabbling across the cabin ruins, and a crack opened in the ceiling just wide enough for a pale eye without a pupil to stare down at me. I realized then that the creatures weren't simply chasing, they were herding. The stairwell yawned wider with a grinding sound like stone teeth. Behind me, the clawed arm snaked out again, not grabbing but nudging me forward, and though every instinct screamed to run back up the slick tunnel, I knew the way had already closed. Rifle raised, heart in my throat, I stepped onto the first stone stair as the humming returned, now slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat deeper than the earth, and the eye above blinked shut, leaving me in total darkness with only the wind from below to guide me down. The stone steps were slick and uneven, carved not by tools, but by something clawing in circles through the earth over centuries, and each tread dipped toward the center as if it wanted to pull me off balance and into the spiral's throat. I held the rifle across my chest like a lifeline, boots slipping on slime, ears full of that deep, pulsing hum, which no longer sounded like a single note but like countless voices murmuring just below the edge of hearing, syllables I couldn't place yet somehow understood in the back of my skull. The air grew colder with each turn, not the sharp cold of winter but a damp cave chill that smelled of stone, animal dens, and something sweetly rotten, and my breath condensed in white ribbons that curled upward before being sucked down the spiral like smoke into a drain. The walls glimmered faintly, veined with roots that pulsed like veins themselves, carrying a thin green light that bled into the steps and cast my shadow huge and warped across the curve ahead. I tried not to think of the eye above closing, or of how completely the cabin had vanished, or of my uncle's last words. I only kept moving because stopping meant letting the thing behind me touch me again, and I couldn't bear that thought. After what felt like hours, the steps flattened into a low corridor where the ceiling brushed my hair and the floor sloped slightly toward a black pool at the far end. All along the walls were carvings, not human carvings, but gouged symbols repeating in rows, spirals inside spirals, long stick-like figures with antlered heads, and every time my lantern beam brushed them, the hum shifted pitch as if in response. I knelt at one and traced it with a trembling finger. The stone was warm and sticky, and when I pulled my hand back, it glowed faintly green like the foam in the nest. Then, the sound of claws on stone echoed from behind me, not hurried but steady, and a faint wet breathing filled the corridor like two bellows working in tandem. I ducked into a narrow side passage barely wide enough to squeeze through, heart hammering, and crept along by feel until it opened into a chamber far larger than the one above. The ceiling arched high overhead and was lost in darkness except for strings of phosphorescent moss that draped like chandeliers, and in the center of the floor yawned a circular pit rimmed with skulls, deer, bear, something larger I couldn't name, their sockets stuffed with moss that quivered as if alive. At the edge of the pit lay what remained of a backpack, shredded and slick with dark stains, and a cracked thermos I recognized from old family trips. I dropped to my knees, bile rising in my throat. Before I could reach for it, a voice like a whisper of wind slid across the chamber. Not a roar, not a hum, but words, my name drawn out syllable by syllable until it barely resembled sound at all. I spun, rifle up, but the chamber was empty, save for shadows shifting along the walls where no light fell. The whisper came again, closer now, and from the pit a slow exhalation rose, carrying with it that coppery sweet scent. A shape moved below, massive but indistinct, like a whale circling just under dark water. The green veins in the walls flared bright enough to blind me for an instant, and in that light I saw the creatures from above standing at the chamber's edge. 3 of them now, long arms folded, heads bowed as if in reverence, eyes blank white. They weren't looking at me. They were waiting. Something stirred beneath the pit, a sound like stone cracking, mixed with wet flesh, tearing, and a pair of antlered shapes began to rise out of the darkness, not bone but living growths sprouting from a head so huge it made the others seem like children. The whisper became a low chuckle that vibrated my teeth. My knees locked. The rifle sagged in my hands. The antlers brushed the ceiling and flakes of stone fell like snow. Between them blinked two eyes deeper than caves, not blind like the smaller ones, but luminous and old. And when its gaze met mine, the hum stopped entirely. In that silence, I understood without words that I had not been hunted but led, not chosen as prey but as something else. And before I could scream, the three smaller creatures raised their hands in unison, and the pit began to glow with a soft green light that reached up and wrapped around my ankles like mist, tugging gently but firmly toward the edge. The green light clinging to my ankles felt neither liquid nor solid, but something between, like countless fine hairs brushing against my skin in rhythmic pulses, and every pulse carried a faint shiver up my spine until it seemed my heartbeat had been replaced by that slow, alien rhythm. I tried to lift my boots, but the mist tightened, not harshly but insistently, drawing me inch by inch toward the lip of the pit where the antlered head waited, its massive crown swaying slightly, as if sniffing an unseen current. The three smaller creatures did not move except for a tremor in their long fingers, their heads still bowed, eyes milky and unblinking. I raised the rifle and fired into the pit again, the blast deafening in the cavern, but the bullet vanished into the blackness without a sound of impact, and the recoil almost tore the weapon from my hands. The antlered head tilted, a ripple of moss falling from its crown, and a deep vibration rolled through the floor like a subterranean wave. All around the chamber, the carved symbols began to glow, green, then red, then black, cycling like a heartbeat, and the skulls ringing the pit rattled as if laughing. I stumbled backward, but the mist tightened and my boots skidded over slick stone until my toes hung over empty air. When I looked down, the black pool was gone, replaced by a swirling funnel of light and shadow that seemed to stretch forever, its sides lined with twisting root-like tendrils that moved as if alive. Deep within that funnel, something vast stirred. Not a single creature, but a mass, a colony, a hive mind of writhing shapes that merged and split like smoke, each bearing flashes of antlers, claws, jaws, eyes, as if it contained every predator the forest had ever birthed. The whispering returned, louder now, in 1,000 overlapping voices that formed my name, my uncle's name, and words I couldn't understand but felt in my blood. My hands went numb. The rifle slipped and clattered across the stone into the pit where it was instantly swallowed by darkness. The antlered head lifted fully from the funnel now, its neck impossibly long, torso hidden beneath the roiling mass below, and I saw its mouth was not a mouth at all, but a vertical slit of glistening darkness ringed with teeth like polished stone. It opened, and the voices became a chord so deep, the moss in the skulls blew back like grass in a storm. I fell to my knees, palms pressed to the cold stone, and images flooded my mind. Endless pine forests stretching under black skies, rivers running green with foam, shapes moving just beyond sight. And at the center, a spiral burrow curling down and down to this place. I saw my uncle kneeling at the same edge years ago, his face pale, his hand clutching his journal as the mist wrapped him just as it did me. And then the vision broke. One of the smaller creatures stepped forward, laid its claw gently on my shoulder, and for an instant its milky eyes cleared to reveal human irises, my uncle's eyes, before clouding again. It pressed down slightly, and the mist surged, pulling me forward until my chest hung over the void. I clawed at the stone, but it crumbled in my fingers like dried bark. The antlered head lowered until its teeth were inches from my face, and in the blackness of its mouth I saw not death, but a tunnel opening into another world of green light and endless roots. The voices fell silent. All that remained was the sound of my own breath and a slow heartbeat that was not mine but matched mine perfectly, like an echo from beneath the earth. The creature's jaws widened and the mist rose up around me, wrapping my arms, my throat, my head in a cool embrace. I tried to scream, but the sound dissolved into the hum, and as I was pulled forward into the darkness, I realized, with a clarity sharper than any fear, that whatever waited below did not simply want to eat me. It wanted to add me to the song. I didn't fall so much as dissolve. The instant the green mist closed over my face, the pit, the antlered head, the chamber above all folded inward like a paper lantern collapsing, and my body stretched into a thread of light drawn downward through an endless spiral of pulsing roots, every inch of me humming with that deep, alien rhythm, until I could no longer tell where my heartbeat ended and the earth's began. The air, if it was air, tasted of iron and pine sap and something older, a mineral sweetness that made my teeth ache. And though my eyes were open, there was no darkness, only a dim green glow radiating from every surface, veins of light twisting away in every direction like capillaries. I drifted, weightless, and when I looked at my hands, I saw not skin, but faint outlines of bone and muscle glowing through a translucent film, as though I'd been peeled of everything superficial and left as a diagram of myself. Around me moved shapes too large to comprehend, slow as glaciers yet fluid as smoke, each bristling with antlers or claws or wings, sometimes splitting into dozens of smaller bodies before knitting back together, like a school of living shadows. Their movement formed currents in the root sea, and the currents carried me along corridors that opened and closed like the throats of giant worms. In the distance, I glimpsed structures built from bones and stone, spirals upon spirals rising like towers and sinking like screws into the green glow. And on those towers, figures stood or clung, long-armed and wide-eyed, humming low songs that vibrated the root walls. Some were huge like the ones above, some small, some so human-shaped they could have been men wearing moss-woven cloaks. And when their faces turned toward me, I recognized hints of people I'd known. A hunter from town gone missing last winter, a schoolmate vanished on a camping trip decades ago, and my uncle kneeling among them, his hair gone gray, his eyes filmed white but his mouth forming my name. Though no sound came out, the mist wrapped him like roots wrap a tree stump, and when he reached out a hand, it passed straight through mine as if he were already half soil, half song. A deeper vibration rolled through the sea then, a heartbeat far below, and all the shapes turned toward a single direction where the glow thickened into a column of brighter light like the core of a star. I was drawn along with them, through arches of bone and tunnels of root that narrowed and widened in time with the pulse, until at last we spilled into a vast hollow where the ceiling was lost in swirling mist, and the floor was a mirror-flat pool of green light. At its center rose the true form of what had worn the antlered head above, a mountain of living root and bone, whose countless mouths whispered in unison, forming a spiral of sound that bent the space around it. As I floated closer, my memories flickered like torn photographs. The cabin, the creek, sunlight through pines, and each image was drawn from me as if siphoned, leaving me lighter but emptier. The enormous presence tilted what might have been a head, and the pool rippled outward with a slow exhalation that smelled of rain and grave soil. I felt the hum not just in my ears but in my marrow, a question without words but with meaning. Stay or go? Surrender or resist? In that moment, I knew why my uncle had never returned. Not because he'd been eaten, but because he had chosen to remain, to be woven into the choir beneath the roots. The green light rose higher around my chest, cool and almost tender, and I felt the pull of countless voices at the edge of hearing, promising silence, belonging, an end to the ache of fear. But somewhere above, faint as a breeze, came the smell of pine needles and sunlight and the rush of the creek. And in that flicker of memory, I found a sliver of myself, still unclaimed. I clenched it like a knife and tried to push upward through the mist. But the roots tightened and the choir swelled, and the column of light opened into a spiral mouth beneath me, waiting. The spiral mouth yawned wider beneath me, not an opening in the floor, but a vortex in reality itself. And the green light streaming up from it flickered with images like reflections on water. Not my memories this time, but forests burning under black skies, glaciers calving into oceans thick with foam, cities of bone and moss rising from endless roots. The choir's hum swelled until it felt as though my ribs would crack and pour my heart into that vortex like spilled seed. The cool tendrils of mist that had once only held me now hardened, knitting into cords like wet rope around my waist and arms, tugging me downward with slow, deliberate strength. I fought, clawing at the glowing roots, but my fingers passed through them as through smoke, and every movement left a smear of green light across my skin that burned cold and sank in like ink. Around the pool, the countless shapes, antlered, winged, clawed, some still bearing scraps of human clothing, began to sway in unison, their long fingers weaving gestures that bent the air. Each gesture twisted the pull of the vortex tighter until my knees buckled. In the depths of the spiral mouth, something vast stirred, a shape like a spine coiling and uncoiling, and when it rose far enough for its upper half to breach the light, I saw it was not a single creature, but a lattice of hundreds of bodies fused into one, each with its own blind head and clawed arms, turning in slow synchronicity around a shared core. Its many mouths opened as one, and the chord of the choir cut off, replaced by a single clear note so pure and sharp it sliced through my thoughts, leaving only stillness and a voice inside that stillness that was not sound at all, but a presence pressing against the inside of my skull. It did not speak words, yet I understood. You were never prey. You are a seed. You will root here and grow the song higher. My uncle stood at the edge of the pool among the white-eyed throng, his face slack, but his hand rising an inch as though to wave me back. The mist coiled around his arm and drew it down before he could. That sight sparked a defiance I didn't know I had. I shoved both hands into the glowing pool, not to accept it, but to push. The cold burned like liquid nitrogen. The tendrils recoiled slightly, and for a heartbeat I felt an upward rush of air, a thread leading back to the pine-scented world above. The vortex shuddered. The massive lattice of bodies twisted, turning all its heads toward me, and the note sharpened into a hiss. Roots shot from the pool like spears, wrapping my legs, my chest, my throat. But in the struggle, my boots struck something hard on the floor, the cracked thermos I'd seen near the pit's edge earlier. It wasn't just debris. Inside rattled a small glass vial sealed with wax, the sort my uncle used for sap samples, but instead of green, it glowed faintly gold, a color that seemed out of place in this world. I snatched it up, the roots tearing at my arms, and in desperation smashed it against the stones. The gold liquid splashed across the pool, and where it touched, the green light hissed like water on a hot pan, retreating in rivulets. The choir faltered. The vortex wavered. A gust of air colder than any yet blew upward, carrying with it the scent of frost and sunlight. The lattice screamed, not in my ears, but in my bones, and its antlered crown cracked like dry wood. The tendrils around me loosened for a blink, and I lunged upward, half swimming, half clawing at nothing, following the thin gold current as it spiraled away from the mouth. Behind me, the green glow surged again, angrier now, and the roots whipped at my back, tearing cloth and skin. But the upward pull grew stronger, a rope of cold light hauling me out of the sea. Shapes leapt after me, their long fingers brushing my boots. But the gold streak flared brighter, forming a spiral in reverse, not a mouth, but an opening. Through it, I glimpsed black trees against a bruised dawn sky and heard the real creek's rush. With the last of my strength, I kicked free of the last tendril and shot upward, my body snapping back into weight and pain, lungs burning with real air as the green world folded below like a closing eye. For a heartbeat, I hung between the two places, one hand still slick with green light, the other clawing at pine needles. And then the ground of Coldwater Creek slammed into me and everything went white. I hit the earth shoulder first hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs, and for a long moment I just lay there, staring up at a canopy of real pines with real sunlight bleeding through, my mouth open but drawing only thin wheezing gasps that tasted of frost and resin rather than iron and rot. And in the ringing silence I could hear birds, actual birds, ordinary chickadees chattering, their small bright calls almost painful after the choir's low hum. My fingers clawed at moss and frozen needles to assure myself it was solid. Each handful came away damp and cold, but clean of foam, and my boots felt heavy again instead of weightless. When I rolled onto my knees, the world tilted, my vision doubled, and for a second the trunks of the trees bent in impossible angles like the root sea's arches. But then they steadied, and I was just in a clearing a few hundred yards from the cabin, or what was left of it. The roof had caved, timbers scattered like matchsticks, and a circle of scorched earth ringed the site as though a slow fire had burned from the inside out. My uncle's journal lay open in the ash, pages fluttering, but when I picked it up, the writing had blurred into long green smears except for a single line on the back cover scratched deep into the cardboard. You can climb out, but it follows. The words made my stomach twist because even before I finished reading, I sensed it. A soft vibration in the soil beneath my knees, a faint smell of damp fur creeping from the trees. I staggered upright, the rifle gone, my clothes torn and wet, and stumbled toward the truck parked down the overgrown track. Every few steps I looked back, expecting white eyes at the tree line, but there was nothing except a crow hopping along the ruins of the porch. Yet as I reached the truck and fumbled with the door, I saw, reflected faintly in the window glass, a shimmer at the edge of the woods like heat above asphalt, a tall shape, shoulders hunched, antlered silhouette fading in and out of sight. My hands shook so badly the keys slipped twice before I managed to jam them into the ignition. The engine coughed to life, but in the same instant the crow launched itself into the air with a harsh croak, and the soil under the tires quivered as though something huge moved far below. I threw the truck into gear and gunned it down the rutted path, branches clawing at the sides, heart hammering. But even as I sped away, the smell of pine began to sour with that sweet rotten scent, and the low hum rose at the edge of hearing, not loud but constant like a pulse under the music of the engine. At the highway, I didn't slow. I drove for hours until the trees thinned to fields and the sun dipped behind distant silos. Yet still the hum clung to me, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, once I swore I saw, far back along the road, a second shadow running in the ditch, long arms brushing the grass. By dusk, I was in Mason Ridge, stumbling into the first diner I found. drawing stares from the few patrons as I collapsed into a booth. The waitress asked if I was okay, and for a heartbeat her eyes flashed milky white before clearing to blue, and I realized the hum wasn't coming from outside at all, but from somewhere behind my ribs. When I lifted my hand to rub my temples, green light glimmered faintly beneath my skin like veins. I dropped it into my lap, heart racing. Outside the window, the last light drained from the sky, turning the glass black, and in that mirror I saw my own reflection change. Antlers, branching faintly from my shadow. The choir was silent now, but I could feel it waiting, coiled deep under the earth, or deep under my skin, and I understood at last what the scratched words meant. You can climb out, but it follows, and sooner or later, it will sing through you instead. I sat in that diner booth, gripping the coffee cup the waitress had left me like it was an anchor to this world, steam curling into my face while the hum under my ribs grew steadier, sinking with the pulse in my temples until it felt like the whole building was breathing with me. The other patrons, a trucker in a baseball cap, a pair of kids in hoodies, an old man with a newspaper, all stared at me a heartbeat too long whenever they glanced up, as though they smelled something wrong but couldn't name it. I kept telling myself I just needed to sleep, to wash the creek mud from my skin. But when I went to the bathroom and flicked on the harsh fluorescent light, the mirror showed thin branching veins of green glowing under the flesh at my temples and wrists, faint but unmistakable like roots under thin soil. My reflection's pupils were too wide and deep, and when I leaned closer, my breath fogged the glass, even though the room was warm. Within the fog, a shape blossomed. Antlers, long arms, then vanished. A tremor passed through the floor tiles as if a heavy truck had gone by. But outside, the night was still. When I returned to the booth, the trucker was gone, and in his place lay a folded scrap of paper weighted with a coin. My hand shook as I opened it. A crude spiral drawn in dark ink, and 3 words beneath. They hear you. I left a wad of cash on the table and stumbled out into the parking lot. The highway stretched empty under a moon the color of bone. My truck sat where I'd left it, but frost had crept up its windows in lacework spirals. And when I opened the door, the cab smelled faintly of pine sap and that sweet rot. I drove anyway, miles of blacktop unspooling under the wheels, but no matter how far I went, the radio caught nothing but a low static that rose and fell in time with the hum in my chest. At some point, exhaustion dragged me off the road into a gravel turnout. I killed the engine and sat in the dark, listening to my own breathing. The sky above was clear, stars sharp, but as I stared, a pattern emerged among them. A spiral again, faint but definite, and my eyes watered. Somewhere in the tree line a crow called, then another, then dozens, a ragged chorus that swelled and cut off like a single organism. The hum inside me answered before I could stop it, rising in my throat as a low note I didn't recognize as my own voice until it left my mouth and hung in the cold air. The moment the sound escaped, the woods shifted. Mist rolled out from between the pines and shapes moved just beyond the reach of my headlights, tall and thin, antlered silhouettes gliding with impossible grace. My skin prickled. I tried to start the truck, but the key wouldn't turn. The dashboard lights pulsed green and the radio static coalesced into a faint melody. The same melody I had heard under the cabin, now braided with a human voice whispering my name. My hands clenched the wheel until my knuckles cracked. I told myself out loud that I was still me, still here, but even my voice sounded wrong, a half-tone lower, threaded with the harmonics that vibrated the glass. The mist curled over the hood and up the windshield in tendrils, writing spirals that faded as fast as they appeared. Then, in the passenger seat beside me, The mist thickened and took on the outline of a man. Not a full body, but a suggestion of one, broad-shouldered, wearing my uncle's flannel. His face was pale and blurred, but his mouth moved, shaping words I couldn't hear. He raised a hand and pointed toward the woods. My pulse hammered. Without thinking, I opened the door and stepped out. The cold hit me, but it felt like a welcome. The shapes at the tree line receded slightly, leaving a path of mist leading deeper between the trunks. Somewhere deep inside me, a voice said, "Run," but my feet moved forward, the hum rising into a soft chant that matched the rhythm of my steps. Behind me, the truck's headlights flickered and died. Ahead, the mist glowed faintly, not green this time, but gold, like the liquid in the vial I'd broken, and with each step, the roots under the soil seemed to pulse up through my boots, guiding me. I realized with a strange calm that I wasn't being chased anymore. I was being called, and that the line between me and the things beneath the earth was now only as thick as a breath. The mist opened before me like a corridor of soft gold and gray light, winding between the trunks of pines that seemed taller than before, their bark striated with glowing veins that pulsed in time with the chant in my chest. Every step I took felt less like walking and more like sinking into a memory, the air heavy with sap and frost and something sweeter, the smell of damp fur and moss-wet stone. My uncle's shadow kept just ahead of me, a wavering silhouette glimpsed between trunks, never turning its blurred face, its flannel bleeding mist at the edges as though the forest itself was wearing him as a mask. The chant spilling from my mouth had grown into a full low song now, words I did not know, but which fit my tongue as if I had spoken them all my life. The vibrations passed through the soil and into the roots, and back into me until I could no longer tell if I was following the path or if the path was pulling me. In a hollow between two great pines, a shape crouched, the antlered creature, though smaller than before, its long arms folded, its pale eyes fixed on me. It did not move as I approached. Instead, it opened its mouth, and a stream of dark birds poured out, crows and ravens that burst upward without a sound, dissolving into ash above the canopy. The creature's eyes rolled back, and for a moment its face flickered, becoming my own, then my uncle's, then a dozen others I didn't recognize. The chant from my chest rose unbidden in pitch, and the glowing veins of the trees brightened, twisting around the trunks in spirals like the carvings under the cabin. Behind me, the path closed, mist folding inward, and when I glanced back, I saw only a wall of pines, no sign of my truck or the world I had left. The forest floor sloped downward, roots knuckling up through the soil to form steps. I descended without hesitation, my hands brushing bark that felt like living skin, warm and slightly trembling beneath my fingertips. At the base of the slope, a clearing opened around a shallow pool of water blacker than night, its surface unbroken but glowing faintly from within as though lit by stars trapped below. The antlered creature knelt at the edge of the pool, dipping its long fingers into the water. When it drew them out, the liquid clung to its claws like strands of glass and dripped without sound. My uncle's shadow stopped beside me, turned its blurred face toward mine, and for an instant its eyes cleared again, and I saw his fear and pity and resignation all at once. It reached out, touched my shoulder lightly, and dissolved into gold mist that drifted across the pool. The song inside me faltered, and I dropped to my knees, staring into the black water where shapes moved far below. Cities of roots and bone, endless caverns, an ocean of antlered things swaying as one. In the reflection, I saw myself with antlers sprouting from my temples, skin traced with green veins like a map of rivers. My hands shook, But when I raised them to my head, there was nothing there, only hair damp with frost. The antlered creature turned its gaze on me, tilted its head, and extended a claw wet with black water toward my chest. Without thinking, I leaned forward and pressed my palm to its, the liquid smearing between us, cold and burning at once. The chant inside me stopped. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, and then a sound deeper than sound, a pressure, a warmth, blooming in my sternum. It was not hunger, not fear, but recognition, as if something that had always been waiting beneath my skin had finally been named. The creature withdrew its claw and gestured toward the pool. The water's glow intensified, shifting from black to green to gold. Beneath its surface, the shapes moved closer, reaching upward like roots toward sunlight. The air thickened, my vision blurred, and in the shimmer of the pool I saw not a reflection, but a doorway spiraling down, endless and inviting. My pulse slowed to match the rhythm of the glowing trees. The forest itself leaned inward, branches forming a cathedral of shadow and light. Somewhere far above, crows circled in silence. Somewhere far below, something called my name in a voice that was now partly my own. I knelt at the edge of the pool, the gold-green light licking my fingers as though it were liquid sunlight, and stared down into its depths where the shapes churned like a slow storm, antlered heads swaying, limbs weaving together into impossible geometries. And for the first time I felt the pull not as a force, but as a suggestion, a breath against my chest, coaxing me to step forward, to sink, and become one with the pulse beneath the earth. My reflection shimmered in the water but was not mine. It was tall, long-limbed, eyes blank white, and the veins of green under its skin throbbed in rhythm with the song now roaring inside me, a melody I knew and did not, a language older than memory, yet intimate as a heartbeat. The antlered creature knelt beside me, shoulders brushing mine, its face a blur that flickered between human and something older, something immense. And when its clawed fingers dipped into the water, the glow expanded outward in waves that licked at my chest and spread down my arms and legs. And in that instant, the hum inside me split into two. My own pulse and the pulse of the root sea, synchronized, intertwined, inseparable. I swallowed hard, breath catching, and leaned forward until my hands broke the surface, cold fire of light climbing my arms as ripples spread outward and the water seemed to breathe, rising like a tide and curling around me. For a heartbeat, the forest vanished. The air thickened, glowing veins lanced into my vision, and I saw tunnels carved in stone and root stretching down into infinity, spiraling endlessly into the green-gold light, towers of bone and moss rising from the liquid, and in the distance a cathedral of shapes, antlered, clawed, winged, swaying to a rhythm that now throbbed in my chest as though I were the conductor and the choir. The pull beneath my feet intensified, rooting into the soles of my boots, and I realized the pool was not water but a membrane, a threshold, the thin skin between my world and the one below. My uncle's shadow hovered on the far edge, half fused with mist, face unreadable, hand raised in a silent warning. I hesitated, breath fogging the golden air, and the hum surged into a crescendo, echoing in my marrow, calling my name, shaping the song into tendrils that wrapped around my chest and throat, and I understood that stepping forward was no longer choice but surrender. My foot moved first, then the other, and the membrane gave slightly, rippling under my weight as if testing me, then parted with a hiss like air leaving a cavern. I sank in slowly, the cold glow rising past my knees, my chest, my shoulders, the song inside me unspooling into the shapes below, merging with the pulse of the root sea. The antlered creature dipped its head toward me, and I felt the gold-green light tangle in my hair and veins as my body dissolved into something more than flesh, more than human, a thread in the lattice of bone, root, and mist. Shapes shifted around me, hundreds, thousands, all moving in harmony, welcoming and judging, and my heartbeat aligned with theirs as the floor of the forest disappeared above and the cathedral of the underground swallowed me completely. The sensation was vertigo, rapture, and terror all at once. I could feel every limb extend and retract, sense branches growing from my shoulders, tendrils of moss curling along my spine, and yet the center of me remained, the self that had clawed through the cabin, slid down tunnels, crossed pits of gold mist. The choir began a low chant that was no longer theirs or mine but ours, echoing across the endless green-gold cathedral, and I understood that the song would continue, carried by every root, every antlered head, every shape beneath the earth. And in the deepest pulse of it, in the cadence of all those combined voices and heartbeats, I realized the truth. I had not escaped. I had not been consumed. I had been claimed, woven into something vast, eternal, a seed that would sing beneath the pines forever. And the hum in my chest was no longer mine alone. It was the earth's song, and it would not end. The first sensation was not fear, but weightlessness, a pulsing harmony that seemed to flow from the tips of my fingers down into the roots beneath me, through the lattice of antlered and clawed shapes, through the black-green-gold cathedral that stretched endlessly below and into every vein of my body until I could no longer tell where I ended and the world began. I tried to lift my arms, and they stretched impossibly long, fingers brushing distant walls of roots and bone that shimmered with the faint light of trapped stars. And yet, every movement felt natural, predetermined, as if my body had always belonged to this pulse, this song, this choir. The antlered creatures swirled around me, not threatening but guiding, their forms now blurred, half root, half flesh, all movement in harmony with the rhythm thrumming inside my chest. The low hum that had followed me from the cabin now full-bodied and rich, entwining with my own heartbeat until I could no longer separate it from my will. I touched the glowing walls, and the roots quivered, bending toward my hands as though recognizing me, acknowledging that I was now part of the pattern, part of the endless spiraling cathedral beneath the pines. And when I drew a deep breath, it was as though the air itself vibrated in tune with me, carrying the scent of wet moss, damp earth, pine, and something older, something alive that had always waited beneath the world. The pool where I had crossed still shimmered faintly, but now I understood it was not a threshold, but a womb, the membrane between my former self and the being I had become. And as I glanced downward, I saw shapes moving like schools of fish through the glowing liquid, not separate creatures, but extensions of the lattice, threads of song weaving up into me, carrying memories, instincts, and the faint whisper of every soul who had ever crossed this cathedral before. I realized then that my uncle had not been lost. He had been transformed, like me, a seed in the choir, and his voice flickered within me, soft and fading, guiding me, urging me to listen, to harmonize, to surrender fully without fear. I lifted my head and my vision stretched, 100 eyes opening at once, seeing corridors of bone and roots spiraling outward into infinity, each pulsating with light and song, and the antlered creatures' forms rippled as though acknowledging my understanding, tilting and bowing their long heads in silent communion. When I took a tentative step forward, the floor itself pulsed beneath my feet, waves of vibration rising through me like a tide of melody, and the hum grew into chords, the chords into an orchestration of voices that layered and layered into something so vast it felt like the heartbeat of the world itself. And in that crescendo, I understood that I could reach through the roots and the soil, the tunnels and the trees, touch every living thing beneath the canopy, guide it, sing through it, and that the forest, the cathedral, the choir, and I were now inseparable. Time no longer had meaning. My senses expanded and contracted in waves with the pulse, every echo of movement in the lattice, every sway of antlered branches, every ripple in the glowing pools vibrating in perfect synchrony with my thoughts, and yet myself remained, a core thread, a consciousness aware of the endless song I now carried. I touched a vein of light threading through the wall, and it pulsed like a heartbeat in reply. And I realized I could shape it, bend it, send it flowing through the lattice, through the cathedral, through the roots beneath every tree. And with that awareness came an overwhelming calm, a knowledge that fear, hunger, loneliness, and pain were now optional, diluted into the harmony of the choir, leaving only the pure song, the endless cycle of pulse and root, antler and claw, voice and echo. And as I raised my arms, letting tendrils of gold and green light weave through my hands and shoulders, letting the lattice flow through me, I finally felt it. The choir was not around me, it was me. I was the choir, the cathedral, the pulse. And in that revelation, that understanding, I stepped fully into the endless spiral of song beneath the pines, leaving my old self like a shadow on the edge of a pool, and the first note of my voice, no longer human but eternal, joined the melody that would echo through the roots and the earth forever.